What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 bad games that I personally enjoyed. That is to say, games that at least saw some measure of rough overall reception, but for one reason or another I still enjoyed or simply disagreed with the mass opinion on. Because as somebody who reviews games for a living, that is the kind of thing that certainly comes up here and there. And before we dive fully in on that specific subject, at the end of the day, reviews in particular are simply opinions about a game. They can be more or less thorough, informative, or any other descriptor you would like to add to it, but the thing about opinions is that they tend to not be universally shared. Which is why, in my experience doing this full time, no matter how much you think a game is universally disliked, I promise you someone out there enjoys that game, and it's probably someone's favorite game. And it's exactly for reasons like that I think somebody in my shoes should be willing to stand by their opinions even in the face of general distaste for a game, though admittedly sometimes things do change over time, especially as people play more and more games. You might find yourself looking at a particular game you liked or disliked in a different light, and things like that happen, sure. But personally, I'm not really out here trying to change anyone's mind. Rather, I prefer to look at what I do as trying to help people make their own mind up about a game. If anything, I'd prefer to help people articulate specifically what it is about games they dislike. And specifically what I mean about that is, while it's easy to say a game is bad or it's trash or garbage or whatever else, while you've expressed your sentiment, you've told me nothing. But if you can point at a game and say, I don't like this game specifically because of these particular reasons, now we can have a conversation and discuss the ins and outs of that. And to the opposite end of that, I like to look at games that people think are bad for one reason or another and say, I actually like this game because, which is the gist of this video. So with that lengthy introduction out of the way, let's actually dive into this and talk about a few bad games I actually liked. Kicking it off nice and spicy with, of course, Starfield. A divisive game if ever there is one, and while online chatter might have you believe that this game is universally reviled, if you actually look at its Steam reviews as well as just actual other online review places, Starfield tends to run a bit in the upper range of mixed, so don't confuse people loudly declaring their distaste for it as the universal opinion. Though, while I did enjoy Starfield, I'm not blind to its faults either, as I've discussed in a few videos here and there. In particular, I think exploration is pretty weak, and I wish a lot of the areas of the game felt more like a realized world rather than disjointed quest hubs. And yet, in spite of that, for me at least, Starfield does a lot of things that I like, especially in relation to iterations of Bethesda's formula and looking at actual RPG-feeling things in character creation, or how the faction storylines, if you will, actually have some branches to them where you can pick and choose how you want those to end, or at least attempt to go that route anyway. And in a lot of ways, it felt like much more choice and consequence than I've felt about Bethesda's games in a long time. And those things, combined with other systems like the spaceship building, the weapon itemization and modding, which I think they really nailed in their last couple of games. And for me at least, that was more than enough to have a very good time with it, which was all reflected in my own review of it, and I stand by those opinions to this day. I'm actually looking forward to the DLC in particular, seeing if it addresses anything in a meaningful way that I've mentioned here. Though, not for nothing, I do think we're at a point where no matter what Bethesda Game Studios puts out, people are going to hate it just because. But in the case of Starfield in particular, I do truly believe that that mixed rating it tends to have is probably the most accurate description of this game. It's a very polarizing title, and I even understand why some people don't like this one, sure. But for me at least, it was a very good time. Moving right along to our second entry though, we have the recent CRPG release of Broken Roads, a post-apocalyptic CRPG set in Australia, and just to get ahead of the joke, otherwise just known as Australia. Broken Roads though I think suffered from ultimately being an indie CRPG more or less. And I think people's expectations far outstriped what the game was actually ever going to be. And you throw in some jank and a few performance issues here and there, and you've got a game that received a fairly negative response to its launch not all that long ago. Now, for my part, I said I enjoyed this game, but it was a little short for my taste, more on that in a second, and that most of the things it offered really shone through in multiple playthroughs, so if you weren't going to play it more than once, it probably wasn't going to be for you. Though I did also note that the combat in particular could use a lot of work, with things like items just not really making much of a difference at all. And then you add in just a little bit of indie jank, and it's no surprise that some people didn't like Broken Roads that much. But for my part, the things I enjoyed about this game were simply the more novel things that it attempted to do largely successfully, such as its moral compass system that focuses on your character's worldview and how that can play into different philosophies that then affect what abilities you have in combat, alongside options in, of course, dialogue and paths forward through the game, and even an origin system that allows you to start the game a bit differently, also opening up various dialogue options, etc. And for somebody like myself who really loves both narrative games and CRPGs, the core thing this game was trying to do was very much so up my alley, so it's probably no surprise that I, at least, enjoyed it a lot, even while acknowledging its faults. So in my opinion at least, I think a lot of Broken Road's reception can really come down to simply what people were expecting walking into this thing in terms of the size and scope of this CRPG, which is often the case with many games. And then to end this particular entry out, I did want to mention, just like a quick aside, in my own review of this, I noted that my first playthrough came in at 7 hours, but also that was an extremely low time that most people probably wouldn't be able to pull off because they do not A, review games for a living, or B, specialize specifically in CRPGs, and that playtime would likely be at least double for most people, if not more. But unfortunately, a lot of people only heard that this game is 7 hours and ran with that, trying to quote me everywhere when that's not what I said at all. But alas, the internet. Moving right along to entry number 3, however, we then have the Callisto Protocol. Now, I will say this one has improved a lot since its launch, especially with its DLCs that have made it a bit better, but on launch, this game was largely panned for a host of technical issues, which was very fair. The game had a lot of stuttering, problems with Denuvo that wound up being removed, and a few other things I'm sure I'm forgetting, but I know there was a problem with the release build in particular where they forgot to update it with a specific change or something. So all of that stuff was totally justified, but you dig a little deeper than that and people had issues with the dodge system for the melee combat, the QTE use, and a lot of people saying it wasn't scary. And that's definitely the kind of thing where I have to ask myself what people were expecting going into this, because when was the last time a Resident Evil game scared you? And then people were upset with the dodge system that required you to press the opposite movement key to the side an enemy was attacking you from, which I admit did feel a little bit clunky, but realistically I don't think it was that much different compared to simply binding dodge to a hotkey or something. So it just wasn't a significant issue to me personally. Now, in terms of what I liked about the Callisto Protocol was mainly the atmosphere and how visceral a lot of the melee combat felt. Because oftentimes combat was frantic due to things like, of course, limited ammo, enemies designed to get the drop on you, and just an overall environment that felt very, very oppressive, especially since it's set in space, and you are pretty well trapped here. Though I would say towards the end of the game you can become a little bit overpowered if anything, which can make it seem a little bit easy. So overall, for me at least, while I would hardly consider the Callisto Protocol like some incredible game that you absolutely have to play, I do think it was a lot of fun and not nearly as bad as a lot of people made it out to be, which is a nice place to move right along to number 4. An entry that I think really personifies what this list is all about, which is Dragon Age Inquisition, a game I like quite a bit. In fact, a lot of people enjoy it, because if you look just about anywhere, its review ratings are always in the positive range. However, it is one of those games where if you were to look online, Dragon Age Inquisition is the worst thing that's ever happened to gaming and should be chucked into a black hole, which is, of course, your natural internet hyperbole. But as I've mentioned in a lot of different videos and places, I think the Dragon Age series' main problem is that all 3 of the main games are just very, very different from one another, and what people like about one isn't what the other 2 are really trying to do, and thus you have a big split in the fan base about what is and isn't a Dragon Age game or what it should be emphasizing, because depending on which one of those 3 games you like the most, you have a different opinion about what matters most in these games. And thus, a game like Inquisition was never going to win everybody over. Now, personally, having played and reviewed all three, I will very much so say that Inquisition is a lot more like Dragon Age Origins than people would like to admit to themselves. At least the people who loudly proclaim that Origins is the best and Inquisition has nothing on it. But to me at least, they're very similar games, and I think a lot of people just can't take the nostalgia goggles off for Dragon Age Origins, which released at a very precarious time in CRPG's really history, and thus they've grown very attached to it, and it is what it is. Now, that's not to say Inquisition is perfect. In particular, I don't think the main story is that great. I think the power mechanic is less than fun, and I also think the balancing is all over the place. But in spite of those things, for me at least, Inquisition provides a lot of fun when you're not stuck in the hinterlands and you can go around doing things like actually having an impact directly on the world by utilizing the Inquisition itself to make bridges, solve problems, take care of things for people, sit in judgment against various individuals, and do all these things that make it feel like you're leading an inquisition. And that's to say nothing about the story, choice, and consequence, how that plays into the incredible Trespasser DLC, and then of course the setup for 4, all of which are things Inquisition does very, very well. Really, my main complaint with Inquisition these days doesn't even have anything to do with Inquisition, but rather EA's insistence on you having to run it through whatever app it is they happen to be using at the time, like Origin, or I think it's the EA app now, which is incredibly annoying. In a not dissimilar situation, however, we then have The Outer Worlds, another game that was actually very successful, very well praised, and yet some of its reception on the internet in particular is that The Outer Worlds is incredibly bland and average and doesn't do anything worth talking about. And yet it sits at an 85% positive rating on Steam and just as well over on Metacritic if you prefer, which makes for a bit of an odd duck of a game, because a lot of people telling you that the game is bad will actually just tell you that they're upset it wasn't Fallout, and admittedly the game was marketed to be Fallout, or Fallout in space if you prefer, whatever. But I think if you take away that expectation of what this game could have been if it were Fallout, then I think it's a ton of fun. I think it's limited in scope, which Obsidian was very clear about it being before the game even launched, which means it's not some massive open world or anything. And yet, in spite of that, I think it did a lot of cool things, like its flaw system that allows you to take on negative attributes to your character in exchange for a perk point. But on that particular side of things, I do think the flaw system would have worked better if some of those were more impactful, because some of those flaws just ultimately wind up being a free perk point. I also think a lot of the humor landed really well for me. It was also interesting to piece together this like weirdly corporate space outposts and why they are so adherent to the brands they're supposed to represent and how absolutely outrageous some of that adherence is. And despite some reports to the contrary, there's a fair bit of choice and consequence in it. The game has multiple endings. I also really enjoyed the DLC for it, which to me at least makes it seem like a lot of people's problem with The Outer Worlds is that it's simply not the game they wanted it to be, rather than anything wrong with this specific game. If anything, for me at least, the game just needed to be bigger in a lot of ways, as the scope was a bit reined in, as I mentioned, and that's what I'm hoping The Outer Worlds 2 does, which is already in development, and hopefully we'll see relatively soon. But in any event, there has been a look at a few different games I enjoyed, even if the overall sentiment surrounding them or their online discussion tends to be a bit on the polarizing side, let's say. In any event though, that has pretty much been it for this particular video, so if you enjoyed it or you absolutely hated it, by all means let me know all about it down in the comments section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Or in the case of this video, if you disliked it, go ahead and dislike it as well, I get paid for that too. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.